What's going on, guys? Welcome to Victims and Villains. If you guys are new to this channel, we create content talking about mental health through pop culture. My name's Captain Nostalgia, and today we're digging into the latest Stephen King adaptation, The Boogeyman. Also, happy 50th anniversary to this short story from Stephen King, which was first published in 1973. Rob Savage's take on The Boogeyman tells the story of a grieving family whose father, now a widower, basically interviews a patient and has that patient passes along the spirit of the boogeyman, and that grieving family now is facing the consequences of that passage. I'm going to start off by saying I have not seen the 2005 version of this story. I know that it is very hated within the horror community, and I am probably going to say something that is maybe slightly blasphemous to horror fans. I was not a fan of Stephen King's short story on this. Before anyone says anything, I love Stephen King. My knuckles literally say float. It is one of my favorite stories of all time. I love The Shining. I love Dr. Sleep. I was just not a fan of the short story. But let's jump into the movie. This movie, however, takes that foundational story aspect of that patient in this one, Lester Billings, who's basically confessing his run-in and the aftermath of the boogeyman and his relationship to his children. I love the fact that this movie literally opens with some of the more disturbing elements of that short story, and then they kind of weave them into the actual story of Chris Mina's family. I think it's really interesting how this movie also progresses to be a piece that is very much of its time. When you look at the original source material for this, it's coming out right around the same time that we are experiencing a rise in paranormal stories, with The Exorcist kind of leading the charge on that. When here we kind of have a new landscape of horror where you're starting to interweave a lot of these very real themes and kind of tying them into supernatural elements, and I think this film does that really well in spades. I love how this film is essentially the dual side of how a family or how a collected group of people kind of share a grief experience. On one hand, you have Sophie Thatcher, who does an exceptional job in this. I am not really familiar with her work, but I just absolutely thought her performance in here was just amazing. Her character, she plays the eldest daughter who's really close to her mom, and she's kind of trying to process and really kind of keep this idea and this concept of her mom fresh and preserved, and she's really starting to work through it through a number of other things that the film explores creatively. And on top of that, you also have Chris Messina plays the father. He plays the husband of the deceased in this, and his entire thing is to bury himself in his work and to never kind of talk about how much he misses his wife or how that pain has affected him. I think this film opens up its own conversation in terms of what happens when a counselor or a therapist experience their own tragedies. Who do they talk to? How do they process? And I love that how the film really explores those themes. I love how it also explores themes of that exact concept, but being a parent as well. I think this film is paced extraordinarily well. I love how the film never feels like it speeds up in certain parts, or it never feels like it lags. It's constantly going at the same pace. It really allows these characters to feel natural and to feel really grounded in this really supernatural story, because in one aspect the film is telling the supernatural story, but because you have that grief aspect and it's linked and it's tied extremely well to the supernatural stuff, I think that it balances both aspects really well. The film never once kind of feels like it's trying to be a character study more than it's trying to be a supernatural. It's very much that these things exist separately, but then as the film progresses and develops, they start to weave one another, and you kind of can't tell where one aspect ends and one aspect begins. I really love the way that Rob Savage, who is the director of Host, if you guys haven't seen it on Shudder, it's a fantastic film. I recommend watching it on a computer because it'll actually enhance the thing. It was made during the pandemic, and it was done through Zoom. That plug aside, I think just his aspect and how he uses lights and shadows, especially around the monster, just look extremely beautiful. I think it heightens the scare factor and allows this movie to be atmospheric. I pride myself in the fact that I'm not typically scared by films. What I think that the Boogeyman does really well is the fact that it takes your expectations for how it's going to scare you and flips you on your head. And it kind of scares you another way. So just when you think it's about to calm down, the lights and the shadows and how certain shots are framed really do kind of envelop you into being scared. Almost forgot what it was like to be scared watching a movie, and I really had a fun time with this one. Let's run this through the Rorschach rating scale, shall we? I'm going to go ahead and give The Boogeyman a 4 out of 5. I think this movie is absolutely exceptional. I think the performances across the board are moving and engrossing, but also at the same time, Rob Savage's use of lighting and misdirection really not only build the terror and the suspense, but it also allows it to feel extremely atmospheric while also exploring real human emotions at the core of these characters. Let's talk about mental health, shall we? If you guys are new to our content, Mental Health Moment is where we take a theme of mental health out of the film which we're reviewing, talk about it for a few moments in the hopes to deconstruct the stigma surrounding mental health. This film is just absolutely rich with mental health themes, and I think that's one of the reasons I love Rob Savage's storytelling so much, because he did it in Host, he's doing it here. But I think, honestly, one of the things that I think this film hits home really well is that the grieving process doesn't look the same for everybody. That quite literally we're all going to grieve in our own way and process things in our own time. For the Sophie Thatcher character, you have this person that essentially is grieving through the immortalization of the person in which she is grieving. On the other side of that, you also have Chris Messina's character that is trying to figure out how to be a solo parent, how to keep his business running afloat, how to kind of have this normalcy. So as a result, he's diving deeper into his work, kind of ignoring the request to actually talk with his kids about the tragedy that just kind of unfolded and reshaped their family structure. And I think in some ways both are unhealthy, but again, they're part of the process of how to actually let go of the individual that is now deceased. The grieving process is something that's really weird, and yeah, I just want to encourage that everyone and remind everyone that it's going to look different for everyone involved. So there's no right or wrong way to truly do it. And to encourage you that if you or someone you know is struggling with anything revolving grief, to check out the links in our show notes below. Check out our mental health resource library. You're not alone. No matter how alone that pain makes you feel, you are 110% absolutely not alone. So please stay with us and check out our mental health resource library below. The Boogeyman is now playing in theaters everywhere from 20th Century Studios. Down there in the show notes below, you'll also find links to not only our mental health resource library, all of our social media, other podcasts that we run, more movie reviews like this, our Patreon, and that subscribe button as well. So check under the bed. Until next time, remember, stay classy.